Hey everyone, today I'm doing a really quick video on why pandas and pans is sometimes missed and why it is misdiagnosed. So the first thing is that some doctors don't have the recognition of pandas pans needed to be able to diagnose it, and they don't have the resources to treat it effectively. Some doctors may shy away, unfortunately, from diagnosing pandas and pans because of the negative attitudes and stigma behind the diagnosis. So this is a big reason why people are sometimes missed. Another reason is that a doctor, understandably, when you go to see them, they're going to think of the most common culprit for causing the symptoms. Now, pandas pans isn't rare. It's estimated to affect 1 in 200 people. However, when someone comes in with the constellation of symptoms that are often associated with pandas, people, like doctors, usually think of Tourette's or Autism or OCD because all of those things are more common than pandas pans. But the symptoms of pandas pans can resemble these conditions. Another reason why people may be missed is because people may not know that PANS is a clinical diagnosis diagnosed using a checklist and not a test. This can be difficult sometimes though, because people think that because there isn't a specific test for it, that it must not be a real condition. Like, some people think that, but then there isn't a physical test for Tourette's either, or autism, so I don't see how that is like a reason not to diagnose it. But some people may not realise that it doesn't need a test for PANS, because with PANS it does help if a trigger is identified. It's something like mycoplasma or Lyme disease or the flu can be a trigger. It can help if those are identified, but to be diagnosed with PANS you don't have to have a trigger identified. For pandas you do need to have a streptococcal infection identified. However, with that, some people do not learn about pandas and pans, or do not seek a diagnosis of pandas and pans until years after the onset. And at this point, the tests aren't going to pick up the initial triggering infection unless you have gone into another flare triggered by a recent infection. Because I had a blood test for strep when I was 10. That was 2 years after my onset. It didn't pick up any strep, but that doesn't mean it wasn't the initial trigger, because there are 2 blood tests for strep, ASO titer and T-DNase B test. And these tests, I think the anti-DNase B can detect strep in the system for longer, but still, after, I would say, about a year, it might not be accurate. So it can be difficult for some people. If they have not heard about pandas pans until later on, it might be difficult for them to get a test that shows something, which may make them think that they don't have the condition, when actually they might do. It might just be that the initial triggering infection didn't show up. Another reason why people may not be diagnosed is if they have a family history of a mental illness, then they might assume it's a genetic mental illness, when actually a lot of psychiatric conditions actually have some sort of an immune component. So for me, I do have a family history of mental illness. Quite a few people in my family have had schizophrenia, but that does not mean that my condition, or even theirs, is purely psychiatric. You can have pandas pans with a family history of a psychiatric condition, and that should not make someone assume that the condition is purely psychiatric, because even psychiatric conditions are being found to have an immune component. But pandas and pans is very often immune mediated, and you can have an autoimmune disease that resembles a psychiatric condition, and that's what pandas and pans can be. Another reason why some people may be incorrectly diagnosed or undiagnosed is because the majority of people with pandas pans do respond really well to antibiotics, and for some people antibiotics can lead to a remission in symptoms, but for some people they don't have that, and potentially, I'm not an expert of course, but this could be because they need something else like anti-inflammatories or IVIG. Some people may have left it late. They may need a different type of antibiotic if it's a different infection triggering it. So some people may assume that if they've tried antibiotics, or if they've been on antibiotics since the onset and it didn't make a difference, they may assume that they don't have pandas pans. And whilst it is true that people with pandas pans often respond to antibiotics, and people with Tourette's and classic OCD usually don't, because they're not infection triggered, then I think that some people, when they don't respond to antibiotics, may assume that they don't have pandas, but this isn't necessarily true, because when I was younger I was on antibiotics for a week or maybe 2 weeks. It was a course of antibiotics and it didn't make a difference to my symptoms. So at that point we kind of left the pandas pan stuff behind for quite a few years, because my mum actually thought I had pandas pans when I was really young, but we kind of left it behind for a bit because we assumed it might not be that, but it was always in the back of our mind. It was only when I was 17 and everything exploded. I developed a ton of debilitating neurological and psychiatric symptoms that could not be explained by anything else, and at that time I did respond to antibiotics, because I got the antibiotics within a few months rather than within a few years. Just because you don't respond to antibiotics doesn't mean that you don't have PANDAS PANS, but for a lot of people they do respond to the antibiotics. But if you have been left for a long time, or think you actually need a different type of antibiotic, then it's always worth looking into. Some people do need more specialist treatment. The reason why people may have a misdiagnosis is because people may assume that certain symptoms that they experience are not part of PANDAS PANS. For example, a lot of the PANDAS PANS stuff focuses on motor tics, and this makes sense because people do not want PANDAS PANS to be confused with Tourette's, because they are different things. But sometimes, because people with PANDAS and PANS can have motor tics and vocal tics, similar to in Tourette's, but it's not the same thing, but similar to, people may assume that they have Tourette's rather than PANDAS PANS because they have the vocal tics. Many people with PANDAS PANS have symptoms that can distinguish their condition from Tourette's, classic OCD, autism, things like that. And, you know, people may have the urinary symptoms or a loss of gross motor coordination, or they may have psychosis, personality changes, things that do not typically occur in those other conditions. But some people don't have those symptoms, and for those people it can be more difficult to tell if they have PANDAS PANS or something else that's more common. Unfortunately, another reason why people may not be diagnosed is because they can't afford to. Unfortunately, some doctors do not have the expertise in that field to be able to treat and diagnose PANDAS PANS. So lots of people have to go private and pay for their diagnosis and pay for their treatment, and not everyone can afford that, and that is really sad because people are then suffering. Same in America, not just in the UK. In America, some insurance companies do not cover the PANDAS PANS treatment, so people may, if their insurance denies, they may not be able to afford to get better, and they may not be able to afford a doctor who can diagnose them because the only doctor who'll diagnose them is private or something like that. Unfortunately, this can lead to people getting diagnosed with lots and lots and lots and lots of different conditions as time goes on, because for some people with PANDAS PANS, they just keep developing new symptoms and more new symptoms and more new symptoms over and over again. And this is heart-wrenching because it can be prevented. Symptoms can change over time in each flare, so getting the misdiagnosis is really dangerous and really harmful, and it's really sad that that happens.